The fog rolled through the narrow streets of the old quarter like a living thing, pooling in doorways and curling around lampposts that had witnessed 3 centuries of passing. It moved with purpose, this fog, as if it remembered the shape of the city from an earlier age, before the glass towers rose in the distance, before the cobblestones were paved over and then uncovered again by preservationists seeking authenticity they could never truly reclaim. In the hours between midnight and dawn, when even the most restless souls surrendered to sleep, a figure moved through these ancient passages with the unhurried grace of one who had long since ceased counting the hours. Aldrich Valerius had walked these streets when they were still cobbled with river stones, when the buildings were new and the air carried the smoke of 1,000 hearth fires. He remembered the merchants who had hawked their wares in the square that now hosted farmers' markets twice a week, remembered the names of families whose bloodlines had run dry centuries before the current inhabitants were born. The buildings had weathered to a dignified gray, worn smooth by generations of footsteps, and the smoke came now from distant factories whose names he did not care to learn. The world had changed around him in ways both profound and trivial, and he had watched it all with the detached interest of one reading a book written in a language he only partially understood. He paused at the corner where a small church once stood, its stone walls having witnessed baptisms and funerals, and the quiet prayers of ordinary people seeking extraordinary grace. Now it was a cafe that sold coffee at prices that would have purchased a family's weekly bread in the century of his making. Young people sat inside even at this late hour, their faces illuminated by the blue glow of devices that would have seemed like sorcery to the congregants who once knelt where they now lounged. The irony was not lost on him. Little was, after 700 years. The title they had given him, king, felt like a garment made for another body entirely. He had earned it in blood and fire, in the terrible years when their kind had warred against themselves for dominance over territories that meant nothing now. He remembered the battles in castle keeps and forest clearings, the councils where ancient powers debated the fate of their shrinking world, the coronation ceremony performed in a crypt beneath a cathedral that had since been bombed to rubble and rebuilt without any knowledge of what lay in its foundations. The old courts had crumbled, the ancient houses had faded into myth, and Aldrich, who had once commanded legions of the night, now walked alone through cities that had forgotten the very concept of what he was. His dwelling occupied the upper floors of a building that had once been a nobleman's townhouse. The nobleman himself had been a friend, after a fashion, one of those rare mortals who understood the value of alliances that transcended the boundaries of species. His descendants had sold the property 2 centuries ago, never knowing that the tall stranger who purchased it had once dined at their ancestors' table, had listened to his confidences and kept his secrets, had watched his line continue and diminish until it finally flickered out in a nursing home fire that claimed the last of the blood. The rooms were filled with the accumulated weight of centuries, books whose authors had turned to dust, their words preserved while their voices were lost forever. Paintings by masters whose names had been lost to history hung beside portraits of faces he alone remembered. Furniture that museums would weep to possess sat unused in corners, each piece carrying memories of hands that had rested upon it, of conversations held in its presence, of lives that had flickered and faded like candles in a draught. He moved through these spaces like a ghost haunting his own existence, touching objects that held memories only he could recall. Tonight, as on most nights, he found no comfort in his possessions. They were anchors to a past that grew heavier with each passing decade, chains that bound him to an existence he no longer understood the purpose of. The hunger that defined his kind had long since become a mechanical thing, a biological necessity stripped of any pleasure. He fed because he must, not because he wished to continue. The blood sustained his body, but did nothing to nourish whatever remained of his soul, if indeed such a thing still existed within him after so many centuries of walking in darkness. He stood at the window overlooking the sleeping city, his reflection absent from the glass. One of the oldest myths that happened to be true. The lights below twinkled like earthbound stars, each one representing a life being lived, a story unfolding, a mortal precious hour being spent. He wondered, not for the first time, how many more centuries he could bear to watch them flicker and fade. He wondered if there would ever come a night when he simply chose not to rise, when he let the dawn find him and end what he no longer had the courage to end himself. It was then that the scent reached him, warm bread, fresh from the oven, carried on the night air like a prayer from another world entirely. The smell was so unexpected, so thoroughly human, that for a moment he forgot himself. He had not thought of bread in decades, perhaps longer. It was a thing of the living, of mornings and kitchens and hands covered in flour. It belonged to the world of warmth and growth and renewal, everything that he was not, everything that he had surrendered when he accepted the dark gift 7 centuries ago. It had no place in his world of shadows and silence. And yet, he found himself descending the stairs, drawn by something he could not name. The streets were empty, the fog thicker now, and the scent grew stronger with each step. It led him through the maze of the old quarter, past shuttered shops and sleeping apartments, until he stood before a small bakery tucked into the corner of a forgotten square. A single street lamp cast its amber glow across weathered stone, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour. 3 in the morning, the time the old text called the witching hour, when the veil between worlds grew thin. The sign above the door read, "Marlowe's," in faded gold letters. Through the fogged window, he could see the warm glow of ovens and the silhouette of a woman moving with practiced efficiency among the shelves and counters. She was preparing for the morning rush, still hours away, and she was utterly alone. He watched her for a long moment, this ordinary mortal performing an ordinary task, and he felt something stir in the depths of his ancient heart, something he had thought long dead, long buried beneath centuries of solitude. He should have walked away. He had trained himself to avoid such encounters, to maintain the careful distance that kept both his kind and theirs safe from the complications of connection. But the warmth emanating from that small shop called to something buried so deep within him that he had forgotten its name. Before he could reconsider, his hand was on the door handle, and the bell above was chiming its small, bright sound. Elena Marlowe looked up from the dough she was shaping, her hands stilling mid-motion. The man who had entered was tall and pale, dressed in clothes that seemed expensive but somehow out of time, a dark coat that might have been fashionable decades ago, or perhaps centuries. His eyes were the gray of winter storms, carrying within them depths that seemed to hold entire ages of experience. There was something in them that made her breath catch in her throat, something that spoke of distances traveled and sorrows endured beyond the scope of ordinary human life. She should have been afraid. A stranger entering her shop at 3 in the morning, carrying about him an air of otherness that her grandmother would have recognized instantly. The old woman had told stories after all, stories whispered over cups of tea on winter evenings, tales of the creatures that walked between the hours, of the ones who had been here before the city and would remain long after it crumbled to dust. She had spoken of shadows that moved against the wind, of eyes that glowed in the darkness, of bargains struck at crossroads and kept for centuries. Elena had listened as a child listens, half believing and half skeptical, storing the stories away in the same place she kept the fairy tales and legends. But looking at this man now, she understood that her grandmother had not been speaking in metaphors. Yet Elena had inherited more than recipes from her grandmother. She had inherited an understanding that fear was often the wrong response to the unknown. She had inherited a heart that saw loneliness before danger, that recognized grief before threat. And in this stranger's storm, gray eyes, she saw both. A loneliness so vast it seemed to swallow the light, and a grief so ancient it had worn grooves in his very soul. "We're not open yet," she said, though she made no move to ask him to leave. Her voice was calm, steady, the voice of a woman who had faced down creditors and critics, who had kept her grandmother's bakery alive through recession and pandemic, who had learned that the monsters in the world rarely announce themselves with fangs and shadows. "But you're welcome to wait. The first loaves will be ready in an hour." He stood very still, as if her ordinary words had somehow startled him. She noticed that he did not blink as often as he should, that his chest did not rise and fall with breath, that the cold he brought with him was not merely the chill of the night air, but something deeper, something that seemed to emanate from within. "I do not require bread," he said, and his voice carried the weight of old libraries and forgotten languages, of prayers spoken in tongues that had not been heard in centuries. "I merely followed the scent." "The sourdough," Elena nodded, returning to her work with hands that remained steady despite the strangeness of the situation. "It's my grandmother's recipe. People say they can smell it from 3 streets away. Something about the starter. It's been alive for 4 generations now, passed down from mother to daughter. My grandmother used to say it held the memories of every loaf ever made from it." She paused, glancing at him with those knowing eyes. "Though I suspect you came from further than 3 streets." Something flickered in his expression, surprise, perhaps, or recognition of a different kind. He had not expected perception from a mortal, had grown accustomed to the blessed blindness of modern humanity. "You are not afraid," he observed. "Should I be?" The question hung between them like incense smoke, heavy with implications that neither chose to address directly. He considered it for a long moment before answering, measuring his words with the care of one who had learned that language could wound as deeply as any weapon. Most would be. Elena shaped the dough with hands that had performed this task 10,000 times, her movements as ancient in their way as his existence. Bread-making was its own form of immortality, the same gestures repeated across generations, the same alchemy of flour and water, and patience transforming simple ingredients into sustenance. My grandmother used to say that bread is sacred, that the act of making it connects us to something older than any single life, older even than memory. She said the ones who understand that, truly understand it, are never the ones we need to fear. He moved closer, and she noticed that he cast no shadow in the warm light of the ovens. Where another body would have blocked the glow, he seemed to absorb it, to exist somehow outside the ordinary physics of illumination. Her grandmother had mentioned that too in her stories, the way the old ones walked between light and darkness, belonging fully to neither. Your grandmother, he said slowly, his voice carrying centuries of caution. She knew what I am. She knew many things. Elena set the shaped loaf aside and began on another, her rhythm unbroken. She lived through the war, the occupation, the years when the city almost died. She saw things that most people chose to forget. Things that happened in the dark hours, things that saved lives and took them in equal measure. But she never forgot. And she never stopped baking, even in the worst of times, even when the flour was sawdust and hope was a luxury no one could afford. She said bread was hope made tangible. She said it was proof that tomorrow would come, because why else would you bake for it? Hope, he repeated, as if testing a word in a language he had not spoken in years. The concept felt foreign on his tongue, a relic from the mortal life he could barely remember. Sit down, Elena said, gesturing to a small wooden stool near the warmth of the ovens. It was the same stool her grandmother had used during the long baking nights, worn smooth by decades of use. You look like someone who has been standing for a very long time. He did not sit, but he moved to where she had indicated, watching her work with an intensity that would have been unsettling from anyone else. But from him, it felt almost like reverence, the attention of someone witnessing something sacred, something they had thought lost from the world. When the first loaf came out of the oven, its crust golden and singing with heat, releasing steam that carried the scent of centuries of tradition. Elena cut a thick slice and held it out to him. Here, she said simply, on the house. I cannot, he began, and his voice caught on the words. I know you can't eat it, but you can hold it. You can smell it. You can remember what it meant once, to be part of the world that makes such things. Sometimes that's enough. His hand trembled slightly as he accepted the offering. The bread was warm against his cold palm, and its scent filled his senses with memories he had thought long buried. His mother's kitchen, centuries before he had become what he was. The smell of baking on winter mornings, when the world was still simple and mortal and beautiful in its brevity. He remembered her hands, flour-dusted like Elena's, remembered her voice singing as she worked, remembered the taste of fresh bread with butter and honey, a taste he would never experience again. Why? He asked, and his voice was rough with something that might have been emotion. Why would you give this to me, knowing what I am? Elena smiled, and there was something ancient in her eyes too, the accumulated wisdom of generations of women who had kept the fires burning through the darkest nights, who had fed the hungry without asking whether they deserved it, who had understood that nourishment was its own form of love, because you looked like you needed it, and because no one should wander through the world without someone offering them bread. He returned the next night and the night after that. Each time, Elena would cut a slice of fresh bread and place it in his hands, and each time, he would hold it as if it were something precious beyond measure, a relic of a world he had lost, a connection to a humanity he had thought forever severed. They spoke little at first, fragments of conversation exchanged in the quiet hours before dawn, words that seemed inadequate to bridge the vast gulf of years between them. But gradually, as the weeks became months, the fragments grew into something more. He learned that she had taken over the bakery from her grandmother 3 years ago, that she had almost lost it twice to debts and disasters, that she rose each night at midnight to begin the long process of preparation, because that was when the ancestors said the bread turned out best. She learned that he had lived in the city for 200 years, that he had owned the building above her shop since before her grandmother was born, that he had watched the neighborhood change and change again while he remained constant, an anchor in a sea of transformation. I was not always this, he told her one night, when the rain fell in silver sheets outside the bakery windows, and the warmth of the ovens seemed to hold back all the cold of the world. Once, I was a man. I had a name that my mother gave me, a village that I called home, a life measured in seasons rather than centuries. I had a father who taught me to ride, a brother who died of fever before his 10th year, a sweetheart whose face I can no longer recall, though I have tried for 700 years to remember it. Elena set aside her work and listened as her grandmother had taught her to listen, with her whole being, without judgment, without fear. She understood that what he was offering was rare beyond measure, a glimpse into centuries of solitude that had never been shared with another soul. The one who made me was a queen of our kind, ancient even then. She claimed to remember the fall of Rome, though I never knew if that was truth or legend. She found me dying on a battlefield, a war whose cause I no longer remember, though I recall with perfect clarity the face of the man who drove his sword through my chest. I can still feel it sometimes, that blade sliding between my ribs, the moment when the light began to dim and I understood that I was ending. She gave me a choice, death or eternity. You chose eternity. I chose survival. I was 23 years old, and the only death I had known was the quick kind, the death of battle, of illness, of winter's cold. I did not know about the slow death, the one that takes centuries, the death of watching everyone you love turn to dust while you remain, unchanged, unloved, alone. Had I known what eternity truly meant, I wonder if I would have chosen differently. But the young never understand such things. They cannot imagine a world where time becomes the enemy, where memory becomes a curse, where the very permanence of existence becomes its own form of torture. He told her of the courts he had known, the great houses that had ruled the night for millennia. He spoke of wars fought in shadows, of betrayals that spanned generations, of loves that burned bright and brief against the backdrop of his endless existence. He described cities that no longer existed, Constantinople before the fall, Venice at the height of its power, Paris when it was still a collection of islands in a river, and languages that no one living remembered, and music that would never be heard again except in the perfect library of his memory. They called me king, he said, and the word was heavy with weariness, with the weight of responsibilities he had never sought and could never truly discharge. When the old queen finally met her end, by her own choice, after 4,000 years, I was the strongest of those who remained, not the oldest, not the wisest, merely the one who had survived where others had fallen. The title was not a gift. It was a burden, a responsibility for a scattered, diminishing people who no longer needed ruling but could not imagine existence without the old structures. And now I am a king of nothing. The courts have dissolved. The great houses are empty or crumbled. We are fewer than 1,000 now, scattered across the world like seeds thrown on stone, most choosing solitude over the company of our own kind. We have become myths, stories that parents tell to frighten children who no longer believe in monsters. The world has outgrown us, Elena. It has no more need of vampires than it has of dragons or demons, or any of the old things that once walked beside humanity in the darkness. Elena reached across the counter and placed her flour-dusted hand over his cold one. The contrast was stark, her warm, living flesh against his marble-cold skin, but neither flinched from the contact. "You are not a monster," she said quietly. "Monsters do not stand in bakeries at 3 a.m, holding bread they cannot eat, looking for something they cannot name. Monsters do not speak of the loves they have lost with such tenderness in their voices. Monsters do not choose loneliness over violence. What am I then? Lonely," she said, tired, searching, human, in all the ways that matter. He laughed then, a sound that surprised them both, rusty from disuse but genuine in a way nothing had been for longer than he could remember. "Human," he repeated, tasting the word like a long-forgotten flavor. "I have not been called that in 7 centuries. The old ones would be scandalized. Then it is long overdue." From that night forward, something shifted between them. He began to help her in small ways, carrying heavy sacks of flour that would have strained her back, keeping watch during the dark hours when she worked alone, his ancient senses alert to any threat. He learned the rhythms of her work, the precise timing of proofing and baking, the subtle signs that told her when the dough was ready. In return, she gave him something far more valuable than bread. She gave him purpose. She gave him connection. She gave him the gift of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in centuries. 5 years passed in this manner, a blink of an eye to him, a significant portion of a life to her. The bakery became his anchor, the one place in the world where he felt something resembling peace. Elena aged as mortals do, though the years sat lightly on her, adding wisdom to her eyes and silver threads to her dark hair. He found himself counting her gray hairs sometimes, each one a reminder that her time was finite, while his stretched on forever, each one a small grief that he hoarded like a miser hoards gold. And then the letters began to arrive. Elena showed him the first one on a cold January night, her hands trembling slightly as she held the official-looking envelope. The paper was thick and expensive, the kind used by lawyers and corporations, and it carried a scent that made his ancient senses prickle with unease. "They want to buy the building," she said. "The whole block, actually, for redevelopment, luxury apartments, a boutique hotel, the usual gentrification that's eating this neighborhood alive. And if you refuse, they'll find ways to make me. They already have." She spread the subsequent letters across the counter. Notices of building code violations that had never existed before. Inspections that found problems where there were none. Permits suddenly revoked for reasons no one could explain. The company behind this, Viridian Holdings, they're connected to people who don't take no for an answer. I've asked around. Other businesses who refused their offers, they're gone now. Health violations, electrical fires, 1,000 small disasters that add up to one big defeat. Aldrich picked up one of the letters, his eyes scanning the corporate language with the practiced ease of someone who had read contracts in a dozen dead languages. But it was the name at the bottom that made him go very still, that made the cold within him deepen to something approaching Arctic. Marcus Thorne. "You recognize that name?" Elena said. It was not a question. She had learned to read him over the years, to see the subtle shifts in his expression that betrayed emotions he had thought perfectly hidden. "I know what he is." Aldrich set the letter down carefully, as if it might burst into flames. "He is one of mine, or he was once, before he chose a different path." The story came out in fragments, each piece more troubling than the last. Marcus Thorne had been made 3 centuries ago, a merchant's son with ambitions that transcended the limits of mortal life. He had sought out the dark gift deliberately, had bargained and schemed, and eventually found a maker willing to transform him in exchange for services Aldrich did not wish to describe. From his first night as one of their kind, he had been different, hungry in ways that went beyond blood, ruthless in ways that even the oldest of their kind found disturbing. "He uses corporations as hunting grounds," Aldrich explained, his voice heavy with disgust that had accumulated over centuries. "Destroys businesses, displaces communities, feeds on the desperation and fear he creates. The terror of families losing their homes, the anguish of workers losing their livelihoods, the despair of dreams crushed by forces beyond understanding. These are his nourishment as much as blood. The old laws forbade such things absolutely. We were never meant to be parasites on human society, never meant to cause suffering for its own sake. But there is no one left to enforce those laws. The courts are gone. The councils are dissolved. He does as he pleases and no one stops him. But you could stop him," Elena said quietly. "You're the king. I am a king without a kingdom, a title without power. If I confront him..." He stopped, unable to finish the sentence, the words catching in his throat like thorns. "If you confront him, what? Then I become what I have spent centuries trying not to be. I become the monster that the old queens were, violent, terrible, wielding power like a weapon rather than a responsibility. I become blood and death and the exercise of terrible authority. I have kept myself apart from the world precisely to avoid this, to avoid becoming the thing that mortals rightly feared, the nightmare that justified every stake and every burning." Elena was quiet for a long moment, her hands resting on the worn wooden counter that had supported 4 generations of her family. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but firm, carrying the weight of her own accumulated wisdom. "My grandmother told me a story once about a wolf who refused to hunt. He was so afraid of becoming a predator that he starved himself, grew weak, and could not protect his pack when the hunters came. She said that power is not evil, power simply is. What matters is what you choose to do with it, whether you use it to protect or to destroy, whether you wield it with wisdom or with malice. And if I choose wrong, then you choose wrong. But at least you will have chosen. At least you will have acted instead of hiding. Is that not what you have been seeking all these years? Something worth acting for? Is something worth becoming again the thing you were, if only for a moment?" He looked at her, this mortal woman who had given him bread and warmth and acceptance, who had seen him clearly and not turned away. She had offered him kindness without asking anything in return, had restored to him something he had thought lost forever, and she was in danger now, threatened by one of his own kind because he had been too afraid to act. In that moment, he understood what he had to do. The offices of Viridian Holdings occupied the top floors of a glass tower that had not existed when Aldrich was made. It rose like a monument to the new age, all steel and reflective surfaces, designed to intimidate and impress in equal measure. He moved through the modern security systems like smoke through a keyhole. There were advantages to being older than the concept of electronic surveillance, older than electricity itself, older than the very idea of buildings that scrape the sky. Marcus Thorne was waiting for him. Of course he was. Their kind could sense each other across great distances, and Marcus would have felt his approach like a storm front moving across the city. The younger vampire sat behind a desk of polished steel and glass, his appearance the very image of modern success. Tailored suit, silver cufflinks, a smile that had charmed countless investors and victims alike. He looked no older than 35, though 3 centuries had passed since his transformation. His office was decorated with the trappings of wealth and power, abstract art and designer furniture, and a view of the city that must have cost millions. But his eyes were old, and they flickered with something between surprise and calculation as Aldrich entered. "My king," Marcus said, the title dripping with mockery. He did not rise from his chair, a deliberate insult that would have meant death in the old courts. "To what do I owe this unexpected honor? I thought you had retired from the affairs of our kind, become a hermit, a relic, a ghost story for the younglings. They say you haunt the old quarter like a specter, talking to yourself and drinking the blood of pigeons. I came to ask you to stop." Aldrich remained standing, his voice calm despite the anger that coiled within him like a serpent. "The bakery in the old quarter, the woman who runs it, leave them be." Marcus laughed, a sound like breaking glass, sharp and dangerous. "The bakery? You emerged from your centuries of hiding for a bakery? How delightfully absurd. Has the great Aldrich Valerius, king of the night, scourge of the eastern courts, slayer of the Crimson Council, has he developed a taste for pastry? Or is it the baker herself who interests you? A mortal woman at your age? How terribly sentimental. I am asking you, formally, as the king of our kind, to withdraw your interest in that property." The king of what, exactly? Marcus rose from his chair at last, his casual manner falling away to reveal the predator beneath. "There is no kingdom anymore, Aldrich, no courts, no laws, no ancient traditions to bind the ambitious and protect the weak. You cling to a title that means nothing, while I have built an empire that spans continents. I have more power in my smallest subsidiary than you have in all your ancient blood. The world has moved on. It belongs to those of us who embraced it, who learned to use its new tools rather than mourning its old ways. You should have had the grace to die with the old traditions. Then you refuse. I refuse. I deny. I mock. That little bakery will be dust in memory within the month, along with the woman who runs it if she proves stubborn enough. And there is nothing you can do to stop me. What will you do, old king? Challenge me to a duel? Report me to a council that no longer exists? Write me a sternly worded letter on parchment with a wax seal?" Aldrich moved then, and the world seemed to slow around him. He had not used his full speed in decades, had not allowed himself to remember what he truly was. But now, facing this creature who threatened the one bright thing in his existence, he let the chains fall away. He let himself become what he had always been, what centuries of self-denial could not erase. Marcus was fast. 300 years of existence had made him powerful by any normal measure. He had killed other vampires, had survived challenges and assassination attempts, had thought himself untouchable in this modern age, where the old powers had faded to myth. But Aldrich was 7 centuries old, had survived the great purges and the wars of succession, had stood beside queens who remembered the world before recorded history. He had drunk blood spilled by Mongol hordes and Crusader knights, had walked through plagues that decimated nations, had watched empires rise and fall and rise again. He was not merely older, he was something else entirely. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, he had Marcus pinned against the glass wall of the office, one hand around his throat, the other pressing over his dead heart. The glass cracked behind Marcus's back, spiderwebbing outward from the pressure, and the lights of the city glittered far below, like indifferent stars. "Listen to me," Aldrich said, and his voice was no longer the weary murmur of a tired king. It was the voice of something ancient and terrible, something that had walked the earth when humanity still huddled in caves against the dark, something that remembered what it meant to be feared. "I have spent centuries trying to be gentle, trying to be kind, trying to forget what I am capable of, but you have reminded me. The old laws still stand," Aldrich continued, "not because the courts enforce them, but because I enforce them, because I am still the king, whether there is a kingdom or not. And the first law, the oldest law, the one that every creature of our kind once knew in their blood and their bones, is this: we do not make war on the innocent. We do not feed on fear and desperation. We do not use our power to destroy those who cannot fight back. We are not parasites on human misery. We are guardians of the darkness, not monsters hiding within it. You would kill me? Marcus managed to gasp. For a mortal? For a baker? I would end you for what you have become, but that is not what she would want. Aldrich leaned closer, his gray eyes boring into Marcus's frightened ones. She believes in redemption, in second chances, in the possibility that even the lost can find their way back. So, I will give you a choice, the same choice that was given to me, once on a battlefield long ago. The same choice every one of us was given, at the moment of our transformation. He released his grip slightly, allowing Marcus to breathe, an unnecessary reflex for their kind, but one that still signified life. You will dissolve Viridian Holdings, every shell company, every subsidiary, every offshore account. You will leave this city and never return. You will find a new way to exist, one that does not require the suffering of others. And you will remember, for every night of your eternal existence, that you were spared by the mercy of a woman who gave bread to a stranger. And if I refuse? Aldrich's smile was not kind. It was the smile of something that had seen empires rise and fall, that had watched mountains erode and seas change their courses, that remembered when humanity was young and the darkness was full of terrors beyond imagining. Then I will forget the lesson she taught me about hope, and I will show you what kings were before the world learned to fear them. Marcus chose mercy. The papers arrived at the bakery 3 weeks later, deeds and titles and legal documents that Elena did not entirely understand, written in the dense language of lawyers and notaries. But the solicitor who delivered them explained that the building, and indeed the entire block, now belonged to a preservation trust with a single beneficiary, Marlowe's Bakery in perpetuity. The trust was endowed with enough capital to maintain the properties for centuries, and its charter contained provisions that no developer or corporation could ever challenge. She found Aldrich that night in his usual place near the ovens, holding a slice of bread that was still warm from the morning's last batch. The steam rose from it like incense, carrying the scent of yeast and grain and 4 generations of tradition. You didn't have to do this, she said. No, he agreed. I wanted to. There is a difference. She sat down on the stool beside him, close enough that she could feel the cold that always surrounded him, the absence of warmth that marked his kind. It had ceased to bother her long ago. It was simply part of who he was, like the color of his eyes or the ancient cadence of his speech. What happened with the other one? He chose to live, to change. Whether he will succeed? Aldrich shrugged, a surprisingly human gesture that looked almost comical on his ancient frame. That is not something I can control. I can only offer the choice. What he makes of it is his burden to bear, his redemption to seek or abandon. Some of our kind find their way back from the darkness. Others do not. But the choice itself matters. The opportunity matters. And you? What choice have you made? He was quiet for a long moment, turning the bread over in his hands. Its warmth had faded now, absorbed into his. Cold flesh, but its scent remained, a reminder of everything he had lost and everything he had found. I think, he said finally, I have chosen to stop hiding. Not to become what I was. There is no going back to that, and I would not want to if I could. But perhaps there is a way to be what I am and still be part of the world. To use this endless existence for something other than survival. To protect rather than merely endure. Like protecting bakeries from corporate vampires? There was a smile in her voice, a warmth that had nothing to do with the ovens. Among other things, he looked at her then, and there was something in his ancient eyes that had not been there before. A spark, a warmth, a connection to the living world that he had thought forever severed. You gave me bread when I needed it most. You gave me hope when I had none. You reminded me that kindness still exists in this world, and that it is worth protecting. You saw the human in me when I could no longer see it in myself. I gave you bread, Elena said simply. The rest, you found yourself. I just left the light on. Outside, dawn was approaching. He could feel it in his bones, the ancient warning that had kept his kind alive through millennia. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, painting the clouds in shades of rose and gold that he could never truly see but always sensed. Soon he would need to retreat to the shadows, to the dark places where the sun could not reach. But for now, in this warm space that smelled of bread and humanity and hope, he allowed himself to simply be. Will you come back? Elena asked. Tomorrow night? Every night, he promised. For as long as you will have me, for as long as the ovens burn and the bread rises, for as long as this small square of warmth exists in a cold world. She smiled. That same smile that had welcomed him on the first night, 5 years ago, when he had wandered in from the fog like a lost soul seeking shelter. It was a smile that asked nothing and offered everything. A smile that her grandmother had worn and her great-grandmother before that. A smile passed down through generations, like the sourdough starter that had sustained them all. Then I suppose I'd better keep baking. The first light of dawn painted the sky in shades of rose and gold as Aldrich rose to leave. But at the door, he paused and turned back, framed against the brightening window, like a figure from an old painting. "The bread," he said. "I still cannot eat it. I will never be able to eat it. But every night when I hold it, I remember what it was to be alive, to be part of the world, to believe that tomorrow might be different from today, to feel hunger that could be satisfied, to experience joy that did not carry the weight of centuries." He paused, searching for words that felt inadequate after 7 centuries of silence. "You gave me that. You gave me back my humanity, even though I am no longer human. And for that, there is nothing I can do that will ever be enough to repay you." Elena rose and crossed the room to stand before him. She was mortal, fragile, a creature of decades rather than centuries. The morning light touched her hair, gilding the silver strands, illuminating the lines that years of work and worry had etched around her eyes. But in that moment, she seemed to him as ancient and wise as any queen he had ever known, as powerful in her simple grace as any monarch who had sat upon a throne of bones. "My grandmother used to say that bread is a circle," she said softly. "The grain grows, is harvested, becomes flour, becomes bread, feeds the living, and returns to the earth to grow again. Nothing is ever truly given. Everything comes back, in time, in ways we cannot predict. The kindness we show to strangers, the bread we offer to the hungry, the light we leave burning in the darkness, it all returns to us, transformed, but never lost." She reached up and touched his cold cheek with her warm hand. "You came to me hungry, not for blood, for something else, something deeper, and I fed you the only way I knew how. Now you have fed me in return, by showing me that kindness is never wasted, that small acts can move even the most ancient souls, that even the longest night eventually gives way to dawn." He caught her hand and held it against his face for a moment, feeling the warmth of her pulse, the precious fragility of mortal life. Her heartbeat was a music he had not heard in centuries, a reminder of everything that time had taken from him, and everything that compassion had restored. "The circle," he said, "the circle." And then he was gone, slipping into the last shadows before dawn, a king who had found his kingdom not in courts or councils, but in a small bakery in the old quarter of a city that had forgotten its own history. He moved through the fog like a memory, like a dream, like a prayer offered in the darkness and answered in unexpected ways. Elena watched him go, then turned back to her ovens. The morning rush would begin soon, and there was bread to bake. There was always bread to bake. It was what her grandmother had done, and her great-grandmother before that, and all the women of her line stretching back to an age when bread was the difference between survival and starvation. As she shaped the loaves, she found herself humming an old song her grandmother had taught her, a song about the night and the creatures that walked within it, about ancient sorrows and unexpected grace, about the way that darkness and light could meet and, in meeting, create something neither could achieve alone. It was a song without words now, the lyrics lost to time, but the melody remained, as melodies do, carrying within it all the hopes and fears and loves of the generations who had sung it. The fog still clung to the streets outside, and the lampposts still flickered with their ancient light. But somewhere in the shadows, a vampire king walked with purpose for the first time in centuries, carrying with him the scent of bread and the memory of kindness. He had found something worth protecting, something worth becoming again, the creature he had always been. And in finding it, he had discovered that even eternal darkness could contain seeds of light. And in the small bakery on the corner of the forgotten square, the ovens glowed warm against the darkness, beacons of hope in a world that had never stopped needing them. The bread rose as it had always risen, shaped by hands that carried centuries of tradition, nourished by a starter that held the memories of every loaf ever made from it. And outside, the city began to wake, never knowing that it had been protected by a king and a baker, by ancient power and simple kindness, by the circle that connects all living things and all the things that have lived. The circle continued as it always had, as it always would, grain to flour, flour to bread, bread to life, and life, in all its mortal and immortal forms, returning once more to the endless cycle of giving and receiving, of hunger and nourishment, of solitude and connection. Some called it fate, some called it chance. The old ones, the ones who remembered the beginning, called it something else entirely. They called it love. Some stories do not end, They simply find new ways to continue, in the shadows and the light, in the spaces between heartbeats, in the warm scent of bread rising in the hours before dawn. They weave themselves into the fabric of the world, becoming part of the great tapestry that connects all souls across all ages. This was one of those stories, and in the old quarter of a city that remembered nothing and forgot everything, it continues still, whispered in the steam rising from fresh-baked loaves, echoed in the footsteps of those who walk the streets after midnight, carried on the fog that rolls through the narrow passages like a blessing or a prayer. It continues in the warmth of ovens and the cold of shadows, in the eternal dance of mortal and immortal, in the simple miracle of bread offered freely to a stranger in need. It continues still,